years, no one suspected a thing. Murray Troy Travis was just another face in the crowd, a man who kept to himself, worked ordinary jobs, and never raised suspicion. But behind closed doors, he was hiding something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. By the time authorities uncovered the truth, it was too late. Too late for his victims, too late for justice. Born on October 25, 1965 in St. Louis, Missouri, Travis grew up in a struggling neighbourhood where getting by was a daily challenge. Details about his early years are scarce, but one former teacher remembered him, not for his achievements, but for an odd quality that set him apart. After graduating high school in 1985, he joined the Army Reserve, training as a medical and dental assistant. Over the years, he worked various jobs, driving trucks, volunteering at a nursing home, and blending into everyday life. At first glance, his story was unremarkable. He was quiet, unassuming, and never caused trouble. At least not in ways people could see. But beneath the surface, his life was unraveling. By 1987, he had developed a crippling crack cocaine addiction. In just 1 year, he was spending up to $300 a day on drugs, spiraling out of control. Desperate for cash, he turned to robbery, hitting 5 shoe stores in just over a week. When the police finally arrested him, he didn't resist. In fact, officers later described him as polite and cooperative. In court, Travis claimed the drugs had blurred his memory of the crimes. He begged for leniency, insisting that he had completed rehabilitation and was no longer using. But his pleas didn't matter. After months in jail awaiting trial, the judge sentenced him to 15 years behind bars. He was only 23, and his life had already taken a dark turn. But what no one knew then was that this was just the beginning. Barely 2 months into his sentence, Moray wrote a desperate letter to the judge, begging for a second chance. He described prison as unbearable, admitting that he cried himself to sleep most nights and that his mental health was deteriorating. His plea went unanswered. Still, he wouldn't serve the full 15 years. After just over 5 years, he was released on parole in '94 at the age of 29. Those who encountered him afterward described him as an easygoing and unremarkable man. One neighbour recalled how he would hum or sing whenever he entered their shared basement, making sure his presence was known so he wouldn't startle anyone. Another, who often drank with him, never sensed anything unusual about him, an unsettling thought given what was to come. Soon, the world would know him by a chilling name, the Streetwalker Strangler. During the summers of 2000 and 2001, Murray worked as a waiter at a hotel restaurant. One day, a co-worker named Dave mentioned that a friend's stolen car had been found burned in East St. Louis. Murray barely reacted. Instead, he casually remarked that East St. Louis was the perfect place to get rid of things since police rarely patrolled the area. The comment sat uneasily with Dave. How would Moray know that? What kind of person keeps track of where law enforcement does or doesn't patrol? The offhand remark left his co-worker feeling uneasy. At the time, Moray was in a relationship with a woman named Julie, who was working as an intern at KDL News. One day, during what seemed like an ordinary conversation, Moray asked her if the station had ever covered the cases of missing and murdered escorts in the area. It wasn't just an odd question, it was concerning. Between 2000 and 2001, several escorts had been found dead, their bodies discarded in East St. Louis and surrounding areas. But at that point, the public didn't even know about the pattern. The police had deliberately kept details out of the news. As Moray spoke, he referred to the perpetrator as a serial killer. Julie found his interest strange but intriguing. Her instincts as a journalist kicked in, and she brought up the idea to her boss. But her boss had no clue what she was talking about. There hadn't been any reports of these murders yet. Then, less than 3 months later, the police made a public announcement. A serial killer was targeting escorts in the area. The women targeted were African American, struggling with addiction and often without a place to call home. Many of them spent their days and nights on the streets of St. Louis, moving from one corner to another in a well-known area called The Stroll. This part of the city was notorious for its crack houses, where people drifted aimlessly for days, wearing the same clothes for weeks, their hair tangled from neglect. With no shelter or safety, they were left exposed, relying on their next customer to survive. Their work wasn't just a means to an end, it was the only way to fund their next fix. And Moray Travis knew all of this. He knew the area well, not just because of the drugs, but because it gave him access to women who had no one looking out for them. The man responsible for the terror in their lives, the one authorities would later label a serial killer, was none other than Moray Travis. Even now, the full extent of his crimes remains unknown. There is no precise timeline of when it all began, but investigators believe he was actively hunting victims from March 19, 2000, until the day of his arrest 2 years later. What is clear, however, is how he operated. Moray would cruise along the stroll, watching, waiting, deciding. Most of the women he chose were black, reflecting his specific preference. He came across as polite and unthreatening, blending in just enough to gain their trust. To them, he was just another man looking for company, no different from the countless others they encountered. But Moray had no intention of paying for their time. What he had planned was far worse than anything they could have imagined. Once he convinced a woman to get into his car, he took her back to his home in Ferguson, a seemingly ordinary house hiding unspeakable horrors within its walls. What made his actions even more unsettling was that he recorded everything. He didn't just lure women inside, he documented every step. His process always followed a pattern. First, he would offer them drugs, then engage in what seemed like a routine encounter in his bedroom. But once that part was over, his real intentions took over. The mood in the room would shift, and suddenly, he was in control. His twisted desires went beyond physical violence. He needed to impose his will in unsettling and ritualistic ways. He once forced a woman to change into a white dress and put on sunglasses before anything else happened. To this day, no one fully understands the meaning behind these strange demands. But the moment the women let their guard down, he struck. Moray carried an industrial-strength taser, and he knew exactly where to use it. With a sudden jolt to the area just below the collarbone, he would send thousands of volts through their bodies, instantly paralyzing them. From there, he wasted no time. Gripping them by the legs, he dragged them through the house, their bodies thudding against the floors and stairs as he pulled them toward the basement, a space that would later be known as his torture chamber. When detectives eventually reviewed the footage, they recalled hearing the sickening sound of their limp forms being hauled down, step by step. Once inside the basement, any semblance of the polite, easygoing man who had picked them up was gone. Moray became cold, aggressive, and cruel. At the center of the basement stood a thick wooden column, and this was where he restrained his victims. He stripped them completely, binding their wrists and ankles behind them around the pillar, forcing them onto their knees. Then came the questions, sharp, pointed, and laced with judgment. Who is taking care of your kids, he would ask. He made it clear that in his mind, these women weren't just beneath him. They were, to him, undeserving of mercy. In some cases, he even forced them to speak into the camera, giving them a final chance to say something to their children. But their suffering wasn't over. Over the next several days, they endured beatings so severe their bodies were bruised beyond recognition. He slashed at them with kitchen utensils, cutting deep enough to draw blood, splattering it across the basement walls. He made no effort to clean it up. To him, their pain, their suffering, it all meant nothing. After taking a victim's life, Moray would always take something from them, an article of clothing, a piece of jewellery, or anything small enough to serve as a personal keepsake. Once he had his token, he would carefully remove any tapes from his camcorder, ensuring they were neatly tucked away inside a hidden gap in the wall of his basement. With his recordings secured, he would dispose of the bodies in various locations, never settling on just one dumping ground. Among those he claimed was a 34-year-old woman named Alyssa Greenwade. She had been a familiar presence on the stroll, and on April 1st, 2001, her lifeless body was discovered in Washington Park, bearing the unmistakable signs of strangulation. Just over a month later, on May 15th, 2001, 36-year-old Teresa Wilson was found discarded in a ditch near Highway 67, her cause of death identical to Alyssa's. Then came Betty James, a 46-year-old woman who had unknowingly documented her final moments on Murray's tapes. Unlike many of his victims, Betty had spoken her real name when he asked, leaving a haunting record of her existence. When her body was recovered on May 23, 2001, investigators noticed tyre marks on her legs, suggesting that at some point he had run her over. On June 29, 2001, only a short distance from where Teresa Wilson had been left, another woman, 36-year-old Verona Thompson, was found. August 25, 2001, saw yet another grim discovery. This time, it was 50-year-old Yvonne Cruz, whose decomposing body bore clear signs of prolonged suffering before she was ultimately strangled. Then there was 30-year-old Brenda Beasley, discarded in a pile of trash, her life reduced to nothing more than waste in Mulray's eyes. Months later, forensic testing revealed that both Brenda and Yvonne had the same male DNA inside them, DNA that would later be matched to Mulray. As more remains were unearthed, some reduced to little more than bone, investigators could gather very little about how those victims had met their end. To Murray, these women were nothing more than objects to be used and discarded, but each of them had a life, a history, and people who cared about them. Teresa Wilson had a daughter named Chastity, who was no stranger to the harsh reality of her mother's world. Teresa would take Chastity to the place where she worked, sitting her down on a bench beside a public phone while she met with clients. Sometimes Chastity would wait for an hour, sometimes longer, but her mother always returned, until the day she didn't. The night Mulray pulled up to Teresa, he didn't just take a woman off the street, he stole a mother from her child. Chastity sat on that bench for hours, waiting for the return that would never come. Like many of his other victims, Teresa was left in a secluded, overgrown area near the highway, her body discarded as if she had never mattered. Some of the other victims were found beneath piles of garbage, dumped in illegal trash sites where people threw away things they no longer wanted. During this time, the police were uncovering bodies at an alarming rate. Almost every 6 weeks, another woman was found. It didn't take long for investigators to suspect that these murders were the work of one person. But with no solid leads, the case dragged on. Law enforcement agencies across Illinois and Missouri, along with the FBI, joined forces to create a dedicated task force. Even with combined resources, the bodies kept turning up. Each scene told the same horrific story, women who had suffered the same form of cruelty before being abandoned like refuse. The team began to suspect that the killer was growing bolder. In some cases, he left his victims in places where they would be discovered with little effort. At first, authorities thought they were looking for a white male truck driver, considering how many bodies had been left near highways. But as the pattern continued, the theory shifted. This was someone deeply familiar with the area, someone who knew the streets well. It wasn't long before Mulray Travis was given a name by the media, the streetwalker killer. Yet for months, the growing number of murdered women received little attention from the press. It wasn't until journalist Bill Smith decided to write a powerful front-page article that the conversation began to shift. Bill felt strongly that these victims were being forgotten, that their lives were being dismissed simply because of their circumstances. He wanted the world to see them as more than nameless, faceless statistics, but what he never could have anticipated was what happened next. Just 5 days after his article was published, Bill received a letter at his office. At first, it seemed like any other piece of mail, but as he read the words inside, a chill ran through him. The letter began with a reference to his story, stating, "Nice sub-story about Teresa." But as he continued reading, the message took a horrifying turn. "Write a good story about Greenwade, and I'll tell you where the other bodies are." The letter continued. Then, the most unsettling part. "To prove I'm real, here's directions to victim number 17. Enclosed with the letter was a map, an X marking a specific location. Without hesitation, Bill handed the letter over to the police. When officers followed the map's instructions, they arrived at the exact spot where Alyssa Greenwade's body had been left. It was undeniable. Whoever had written that letter was the killer. But in their arrogance, they had also made a critical mistake. The police immediately analysed the map and recognised that it had been sourced from an online mapping service. This meant one thing: the killer had used the internet to generate it. A specialised digital forensics team was brought in to track the origin of the map. With a limited window of time to work with, they focused on identifying every instance where that specific section of St. Louis had been accessed online in the 5 days between Bill's article and the letter's arrival. The map had come from Expedia, a site that exclusively used Microsoft's mapping services. When investigators approached Microsoft for data, the company hesitated, unwilling to release user information, but a subpoena changed that. When the records were finally obtained, the police had their breakthrough. The number of people who had accessed that exact map within the 5-day window was small, just one. The IP address led them to an MSN account, and the username tied to it was unmistakable: Murray Travis. That single digital breadcrumb led law enforcement straight to his home, and beneath that home lay the very place where he had carried out so many of his crimes. The basement that would later be known as his torture chamber. On June 7, 2002, Sergeant Tom Sachs of the St. Louis Police Department arrived at Maury Travis's home in Ferguson. It was early morning when he knocked on the door, and Maury answered, clearly irritated, with his girlfriend standing beside him. His first words to the officer were, "It's 7 in the morning." Without missing a beat, Sachs replied, "Yeah, you're right, and here's a search warrant." Maury, trying to feign innocence, asked, "Why do you need to search my house?" But Sachs wasn't playing along. "You know exactly why we're here," he shot back. At that moment, the police believed they had found the man responsible for a string of murders. But what they were about to uncover inside the house was far worse than they had imagined. As officers moved through the house, they quickly realised they had stepped into something far more disturbing than just a routine search for evidence. They located the computer they had been looking for, but that was just the beginning. Scattered around the room were women's wigs, pairs of high heels, jewellery, and a stun gun locked inside a desk drawer. Alongside these, they found a book detailing methods of torture and articles about his victims. But the most horrifying discovery was waiting in the basement. Hidden among the clutter was a collection of homemade videotapes, each one containing footage of unimaginable cruelty. One tape stood out. It was labelled "The Wedding Day." Unlike the others, this one had been carefully edited, pieced together with different clips showing Maury tormenting and assaulting various women. Then, in the middle of it, the footage cut to a harrowing scene: Cassandra Walker, bound to a wooden pillar, her wrists and ankles restrained. She was pleading for her life. Without hesitation, Maury grabbed a belt and strangled her while the camera kept rolling. The footage was so deeply disturbing that every officer who watched the tapes was later given psychological support. Those who reviewed them described the content as some of the most horrific they had ever encountered. The basement itself told a story of unimaginable horror. What looked like a crude prison cell had been set up, with blood staining the walls, ceiling, and even the furniture. The floor was covered in dark stains, remnants of the suffering that had taken place there. As investigators combed through the space, they found something chilling: a rough sketch of what appeared to be expansion plans for the basement. The drawing detailed his vision for 2 additional cells, each carefully designed with air vents for ventilation. To keep them hidden, he planned to install crawl spaces instead of doors. Since there were no bathroom facilities, he had even listed supplies such as adult diapers, signalling his intent to keep victims confined for long periods. This blueprint of horror showed a level of preparation that sent chills down the investigators' spines. Maury's girlfriend, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious to what had been happening beneath her feet. She insisted that she had never stepped foot in the basement, claiming it was Maury's private space. Whether out of fear or genuine ignorance, she maintained that she had no clue about his crimes. Meanwhile, Maury was questioned for 4 hours inside his own home before being taken in for further interrogation. Initially, the charges against him were for the kidnappings of Betty James and Alyssa Greenwade, but as the investigation progressed, more damning evidence surfaced. A forensic match confirmed the tyre tracks found imprinted on Betty's leg matched those from Maury's car. With this, It became a race against time to identify the women in the videos and determine the full scope of his crimes. But Morey remained stone-faced. There was no remorse, no emotion, just an unnerving detachment. Officers who sat across from him described him as completely devoid of empathy. He wasn't scared. Instead, he acted as if the situation bored him, even asking to be interviewed by someone more challenging. His arrogance was infuriating. It was as if he still believed he was in control. That illusion shattered when detectives revealed how they had tracked him down, through a letter he had sent to Bill Smith. The moment he realised this, his demeanour changed. He started fidgeting, drumming his fingers against the table, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He refused to say another word. Authorities placed him in a maximum security cell under constant observation, a precaution commonly taken for inmates facing the possibility of the death penalty. Scheduled checks were conducted every 15 minutes, but on June 10, 2002, officers at St. Louis County Jail found Morey unresponsive in his cell. He had managed to fashion a makeshift noose from a strip of his bedsheet, threading it through an air vent above the toilet. In a calculated move, he bound his own hands behind his back, ensuring he wouldn't be able to fight against the instinct to survive. 2 consecutive checks had been missed, giving him the window of opportunity he needed. By the time officers discovered him, it was too late. Inside his cell, a letter was found addressed to his mother. It read, "Dear Mum, I'm sorry for the pain I have caused you and the family. My death seems to be the only way out, and a fast end to all of this publicity. You were the best mother a man could have, but I've been sick in the head for a long time, since I was around 14. I don't know why, I was just sick. I have never felt normal or happy at any time in my life." This seems to be the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I don't want to spend the rest of my life locked up, or worse, let them kill me with a needle. Tell Grandma, Marina, James, and everybody that I love them dearly, but I love you the most. Forever your son, Morey Travis. Nowhere in the letter did he acknowledge the lives he had taken. Nowhere did he admit guilt. To investigators, this reinforced the theory that something significant had shaped him into the person he became around the age of 14. But when detectives spoke to those who knew him, they found nothing. No history of childhood trauma, no life-altering event that could explain his descent into murder. Morey Travis never faced trial. He never stood before the families of the women he terrorised, never answered for the agony he inflicted. By the time of his death, police had tied him to 12 victims, but he had hinted that there were at least 17. Some detectives believe that number was even higher, possibly over 20. To this day, law enforcement suspects he was responsible for several other unsolved murders in the region. While theories exist, the true motives behind his crimes remain a mystery. His case leaves behind more questions than answers. A chilling reminder that some criminals take their secrets to the grave. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this case? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to our channel, giving it a like, and sharing it with others who might be interested. Your support helps us continue bringing you more true crime stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.